He and I both went down, as Al said, Pearl wasn't much of a place in those days. It was a small territory of the United States. And the old man said, come on, we're going to go down to Waikiki Beach. And the Waikiki Beach in those days consisted mainly of the Al Moana Hotel and the Royal Hawaiian. And the Royal Hawaiian was taken over as a rest area, R&R. And at the time, as I say, I was only 17 years old, and I wasn't allowed to drink. So my father, and we were allowed 2 beers per man. So my father got my 2 beers. And after that, I left my dad, and we went off, and we went to the invasion of Enuitok, a portion of the Marshall Islands. From there, we were at that time we were attached to Cruising Division 14. We took the Marshall Islands. Then we want to start going up towards Guam, Saipan, which they call the Marianas Group, bombarding, and as I say, it was a cruiser, and we covered invasions of the various islands. We then were going to go into the Philippines. We went up as far as the Ray Rufus and Iwo Jima. We were doing a lot of shore bombardment with the anticipation of invading the places. And when we went, starting the invasion of the Philippine Islands, we were told, we were then detached from Michener's group. At that time, we had 2 fleets, 58 and 38. Actually, we didn't know from one day to the next. We were trying to confuse the Japs to our sides. I was a radarman, and you heard Al talk about this Combat Information Center, and we used to call it Christ, I'm confused, because when things started to pop, no one really knew what was going on. You just hoped for the best. The best laid plans of mice of men. We were then detached. Well, first off, the battle started. We were told to go up to Formosa to stop the Jap fleet from coming out of Formosa so that they wouldn't interfere with the 7th Fleet, which was the fleet that had the amphibious landings. And there again, they had the old World War I, what we call the ancient Navy, the 15-knot Navy, while we could do 33 knots. We were sort of more or less the modern Navy. And when we got up there, first off, the Japs picked off the cruiser Canberra, which was named after the Australian city of Canberra. She took 1 fish. And as Al pointed out, when the time Al got hit, it was cheaper to sink the ship and get the men off. So that was the idea of that. As you can tell, it's the same way. If a plane got hurt, rather than repair it, you just tossed it over the side, because there was more coming from the States. That was one thing about the United States. We had production, while with the German forces and the Japanese forces, they didn't have the production that we had. Well, anyway, the Canberra got hit, and our skipper was, we used to call him Wild Bill Burns. He came from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was an academy man. Ironically enough, he was the same age as my father. And because of being in CIC, the exec battle station was there, and the old man was always down there in CIC knowing what was going on. So with the result, I got to know Captain Barnes quite well. As a matter of fact, his son came aboard ship in Pearl, and I got to meet him as an ensign. He later became the first skipper of the nuclear submarine skipjack. All right, the Canberra gets hit. Captain Barnes volunteers for us to take their spot in the station. We go up, take their spot. Well, the Japs know they're wounded this 1 cruiser, so they intensified the battle on our spot. With the result, we took 2 fish, torpedoes, from Betties, which are bombers at off Formosa, the land-based planes. Well, we took the 2 fish. The old man passed the word around, we abandoned ship. The only ones who didn't abandon ship were the damage control parties. Now, these damage control are people who try to save the ship. And we had an outstanding first lieutenant who later became an admiral, George Miller. And he had gone through the school in Philadelphia, is that you try to salvage a ship. It's much easier to save it than to sink it, and if you can get it back, it's much cheaper for the taxpayer. So with the result, I went over the side, and I was picked up by the USS Grayson, which I named my son. I got back to the States. The ship, they managed to salvage it. They pulled her back to Ulithi, and then she steamed, after they patched her up, she steamed all the way back to Brooklyn Navy Yard and was refitted. In the meantime, I came home, went on a 30-day survivor's leave, was reattached to an aircraft carrier, and I started evaluating this. Going to sea on a surface ship, I only got 20% sea pay. And I was hearing these Airedales talking about this 50% flight pay. Well, I had become an old man. I was 19 now. So I decided, well, I'm going to become a combat air crewman. And I volunteered for the old TBF Avengers, torpedo bombers. I then was attached to a squadron, and we became the first designated night torpedo squadron. And all our operations were at night. Some of the aircraft carriers would perform day operations, ours were all night operations. So when the rest of the fleet was more or less going to sleep, we would take off. And we were assigned to a jeep carrier. Now, if you can imagine, the heaviest single-engine aircraft that has ever flown, carrying a torpedo, 3 men, my pilot, Ensign Kuhn, he was a young man of 19, I was 19, and a guy by the name of Balassa, he was a Hungarian. He was the captain. We used to call him the Happy Hunky because he loved to drink 2 beers and he was out of sight. And that was our crew. We then went up as far as Japan. We were getting ready for the invasion, and the war ended. After the war ended, they converted the carrier. I got detached from the squadron, but they no longer needed Airedales. I enjoyed the 50% flight pay for a short period of time. I then went back and became a surface sailor on board the Kula Gulf. And they started an operation they call Magic Carpet. Guys like Don Watson, who were overseas, wanted to get home. And so with the result, we took the squadrons off, and on the hangar decks, we built bunks 6 high. And we started bringing the troops back from the Pacific. We then, after that detail, we then came back into Norfolk, Virginia. We're going to take our first jet fighters over to Cherbourg, France. They canceled that. I should say that I was also a USN. Because of being 17 years old, the only way I could get into the Navy was sign up with my mother's permission, because my dad wasn't home. He was on board minesweepers. And I got out when I became a man, when I was 21. But I flew into Boston, met my wife. The ship stayed in port too long. Up to that point, I wasn't in port that long. I was always steaming, so we didn't establish any relationships. You didn't have time. I was also discharged on my wife's birthday, and I came home. We then came to Rocky Hill, and I got attached. Once you're brought up in a Navy family, and you get Navy in your blood, I signed up with reserves. And I then got recalled to active duty for the Korean conflict. And then I was stationed aboard a destroyer. But you cannot beat the camaraderie of the Navy as far as I'm concerned. So, by the way, did you know what boats I made by the name of Turcotte on board the Lex? I know you had a big compliment on board there.
Well, there was 3,000 men on that ship.
It isn't like a tin can when you have 264 men.
Well, I took my basic training in the tank destroyers down at Camp Hood, Texas. And that's when the war was going on in Africa, and had ended in Africa about the time I finished the training. So they shipped a bunch of us up to Camp Carson, Colorado. And that's where I joined the 71st Infantry Division. It was rather an interesting situation. The 71st Infantry Division, when it was created, or formed, was formed as a light division, which was in the area of about 9,000 men. Regular triangular division is around 15,000 men. And there was a general who came back from Guadalcanal, put in charge of the division, and the idea of the division was it could go anywhere. They formed two divisions, the 89th and the 71st. They gave jeeps to the 89th, and they gave mules to the 71st. So we trained there at Camp Carson, which you look out the window at Pikes Peak. So you know what they had us doing. We were going up around through the mountains up there. And we had all the units, but they were smaller. We had artillery, and they pulled the wheels off the thing and packed them on the back of the mules, and so on, up. Our combat engineer battalion, we had all of our equipment that we used, machetes, picks, axes, dynamite, everything else. And after that training, they decided to hold a maneuver. Of course, it probably was planned, but just that we didn't know it, in California, in the coastal range of mountains out there. And we maneuvered against the 89th. We arrived at, I think it was Fort Ord in California. And they put us on trucks. We arrived there at night, put us on trucks. They drove us out into the mountains. I think we were about 70 miles from the nearest highway. And that's where we were for 3 months. And it rained for 5 weeks steady. The night we got there, you know, gee, this is great, we're in California. Didn't seem too bad. We just laid down on the ground out there and went to sleep. About 3 o'clock in the morning, it started raining, and it didn't quit for 5 weeks. If you attempted to put up your pup tent, I know a lot of you fellows have probably handled those that have been in the Army. You touch them once and they leak from then on in, so it was already wet. So for those 5 weeks, we were just outside in the rain all the time, sleep in the rain, eat in the rain, climb the mountains in the rain, cut trails in the rain, blast rocks off to make trails and all that stuff. When it was over, they shipped us down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and reformed us into a regular triangular division. Shipped in a bunch of men to fill out the division, and we got all of our regular divisional equipment, including trucks. And in our case, we had, in combat engineers, we got a tank, and we welded a great big bulldozer blade on the front of that tank, which we used for going through mined areas, or in the case of the Siegfried line, where they had built those dragon's teeth, we piled the dirt right over them. And also got through some other areas where we were able to negotiate them. But in Europe, we set up, I think it was Camp Old Gold. And from there, we went into combat in France, around Nancy, that area, Limburg, I think it was, and went through Alsace-Lorraine, through the Rhine, all the way through Germany. And my division got the furthest east of any of the American troops. We wound up in Steyr, Austria. We were actually, we're 65 miles the other side of Steyr. Steyr was the agreed-upon line with the Russians. And we pulled back. We were there, I think, about the 5th or 6th of May. The Russians showed up around the 10th of May on the other side. First day in combat, we were strafed by P-47s. We thought maybe, you know, on occasion, you may have gotten further out than headquarters knew where you were. We thought that was what had happened to us, but that wasn't the case. Those are planes that were captured by the Germans. And they came around 2 or 3 days in a row. After that, there wasn't any of them left come around. So that took care of that. But going through the Maginot Line, we went through in what I call Vichy, but I guess the proper name is Bitch, Alsace-Lorraine, okay? And our 5th Infantry Regiment, which is part of the 71st Division, was in that particular part of the skirmish. So they became the 100th Division was there at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, and they got shoved out. So we relieved them, but they came back in to help. And the 5th Regiment was known as the Little Sons of Bitch. But we captured that, and the battle for the Rhine was a pretty heavily fought battle. I don't know if you heard too much about that, but it was a costly battle. It certainly was costly to the Germans. They had blown the bridges. We attempted to capture the bridge at Germersheim. We were unable to do that, but we did put some assault boats across at Speyer, between Speyer and Ludwigshafen, which is across from Mannheim. And our artillery and the Air Corps bombed Mannheim that night from right through the next morning. Steady. You couldn't believe the din from the heavy artillery and the bombing that was going on. But we put some assault boats across and then came back. At that point, we were in the 7th Army, which was commanded by General Patch. We then transferred to the 3rd Army, which was commanded by George Patton. And we crossed the Rhine under George Patton's command. In fact, he was standing on the shore when we went across, and we had a smoke screen in crossing the river there. And then we got into quite a scrap with the 6th SS Mountain Division on the other side of the Rhine, going towards Fulda. There's a forest up in there, and we completely destroyed the 6th Mountain Division. What was left of it was captured. And we went from there on Fulda. Fulda was their tire manufacturing, kind of like Akron, Ohio, I guess you would say. And they also had a German Army barracks area there at Fulda. And from Fulda, let's see, I think we went to Beirut. And I should have looked at some of the towns, but I'm trying to think of it. From Beirut, we then turned towards the southeast, because there was a great concern that the Germans were going to build a redoubt down in the Berchtesgaden area there of Austria and Germany. And they wanted, of course, to stop them from doing that, and the Germans were. Their armies were fleeing in that direction, fighting all the way. Of course, as they did that, we had several rivers that we had to cross. The Reagan River, the Danube, and it's not very blue, incidentally.
Pretty muddy.
The Isar River, and also the Inn River, which is the border between Austria and Germany. And they had blown the bridges there as well. And we captured 2 hydroelectric dams just before they were going to blow them. The dynamite was all in place, and we crossed the dams and captured them before they could blow them. And we then built, you know how they build log cabins, they park one log on top of the other and so on up. We got a hold of a bunch of like ties, big timbers, and we built them up to the dam. And most of the Army vehicles have forward wheel drive. We put the vehicles in there and bounced up the top and right across the dam with that. I drove one of them across, and some of our vehicles were so wide that they were actually a little bit over each side as you go across the dam. And I was paying very close attention because I had my whole squad with me in the back. I was paying pretty close attention to where the center was, because I realized that this was pretty good. And I just took a quick look to see, and I couldn't see the bottom. It was way down there. I think they had to pry my hands loose for that. But that was I think, as I remember it, the capture of those 2 dams got written up in the newspapers here in the country at the time. It was pretty important. And then, of course, we went on to Steyr. And actually, my division fired the last shots of the Native American forces in the western side. We put up loudspeakers on the riverbank, suggested that the Germans give up. They were on the other side. We noticed that they weren't doing that, but we noticed that there were more and more of them showing up on the other side. So we again suggested that they might like to give up to us because they had 24 hours to do it. Otherwise, they could give up to the Russians on the other side. And we did. We captured a lot of prisoners. Actually, all the way from France to the end, my division captured between 70 and 80,000 prisoners of war. And it's also very interesting too. The Army, of course, was commanded by George Patton, and you know his reputation. The Corps, under the Army you have corps, and under the corps you have divisions. The 20th Corps was commanded by General Walker, who apparently Patton thought a great deal of. He was a good general. And Walker was the general in command in Korea. He was the Army general in command. And he wound up getting killed in an automobile accident, just like Patton did. Kind of strange coincidence. A lot of funny things that do happen along the way. I can remember crossing the Isar River. We went down the river. Of course, combat engineers handle the assault boats. Local infantry boys take them over. And we were down there in that process doing that when all of a sudden we heard the whistle of some mortar shells coming over. So everybody hit the ground, and this one fellow hit the ground. And incidentally, all along this river area was kind of pasture land. You know, people had to cow. This one guy gets up and he looks, and he's covered in cow dung. Another mortar shell comes whistling over and he hit right in the stomach. So, you know, under all the circumstances that exist, there are humorous things that do happen. But it was a very interesting period of time, there's no question about that. And as John says, you make a lot of friends and you become quite close to some of those friends. 71st Infantry Division was having a reunion this month on the 8th and 9th, and I was planning to go for it, but Nancy was coming from San Francisco home to visit us, so I had to take care of that first.
We were in the middle of the first air raid. They never dropped anything until although the war started in England in 39, nobody had a telephone or anything in those days. She said, take your sister, who was 10 years old at the time. So I was complaining. I said, oh, I don't want to go. I'm going out tonight. I've got a date. So she said, well, go see how she is. So I went to see my grandmother, who lived by the docks, right by the docks, not a very desirable area, but she wouldn't move from there. And I was about to leave. I said, we're leaving now, Gran. She said, oh, stay with me. And then the air raid sirens went, and she said, oh, don't leave me. I said, oh, they never drop anything. So she said, oh, please don't. And all of a sudden, it was murder. You know, the bombs were dropping. It was really chaos there. So we went down the Anderson shelter, and you know those Anderson shelters. That didn't last very long. And when we got out of there, the place was devastated. I mean, you couldn't imagine it. Everything was burning, houses were bombed. And her house hadn't been bombed. It was a little old house. So with all the bombing and everything, it had fallen down, sort of, you know. So she picked up a bag, because everybody had a little bag, little suitcase or a little bag with their underwear and so on, so they could escape quickly, and they had a change of underwear. So we had to walk home, of course, no buses running or anything like that. And then they didn't have any balloon barrage, so they were dive bombing, we were hiding, there were hundreds of ships sinking in the docks, they were all burning, they were exploding, and she had to keep stopping to have a drink. We wanted to get home, and she had, well, I must have a drink, I must have a drink. So we had to stand outside because they didn't allow children in the pubs in those days. I don't know if they do now. My sister was only 10. And that was a nightmare journey. It took us so long to get home because every time we passed a pit, I had to have a drink, I had to have a drink. And I was carrying this bag, and I had other things to think about. But I thought, it was sort of heavy at the back of our house, which I thought there wouldn't be any bombing, but there was. But it wasn't quite as bad as where she lived by the docks. And we looked in the bag, I thought it was heavy, and she said, oh, and she was a real cockney. She said, oh, it's my greens and taters. Instead of being her underwear, it was her vegetables I've been carrying on. I mean, we were hiding under the bridge when the bombs and the planes were coming down here. I was with this bag. I would have thrown that out a long time ago.
Anybody else want to talk about their experiences? Nobody else? You want to talk?
Yes, sir.
This is Wilscam. He's our president.
I don't know why I'm coming up here. This is a horrible time. Interesting. We have in our society equipment to record both audiovisual and audio stories. We would love to have a chance to interview some of these people and hear some of the stories firsthand that you have. You know, 50 years ago, it seems like a long time, but World War I veterans aren't around anymore. We would love to hear some of their stories because they would be so interesting, and a night like this could go on and on. So I do want to thank you for your attention, for coming tonight, and hope to see you again soon.